So this week, Andrew, we've heard that we've got 7 billion people on the planet. And of course, looking ahead, the population is going to increase even further. We've got the other challenges of climate change, resource shortage, and so on and so forth. And so meeting the challenge of feeding all of the people that we have now sustainably and in the future, I think is something that really calls on science.
Well, I happen to agree with nearly everything you've said.
Yeah.
There is no silver bullet.
Yeah.
It won't all come from waste, it won't all come from better management. It will come from lots of places, and genetics will be a part of that.
Indeed.
For me, the question is, how far do we go with genetics?
Yeah.
And my biggest worry about genetics, or GM, if we're going to call it that,
Right.
is the concentration of power into a very few pairs of hands.
Yes.
If we could sort that one out and make it usable and sustainable for poorer farmers in the developing world, then
Yes.
I might shift my view a little bit.
I think that many of the targets of crop improvement are targets that will often not have a commercial benefit. There's no incentive for industry, big business, to actually take on the challenge of producing crops that use actually fewer inputs rather than more inputs. Where do you get money from a crop that uses less water than one that uses the current large amounts of water? What I would like to think is that the technology is actually owned by the general public, as it were, that public sector research, pre-breeding research for the common good, as it were, sets up resources that then breeders can use. And so that actually we take the technology out of the hands of large business.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely fantastic to me.
Yeah.
I've seen through my farming career the benefits of good genetics.
Yeah.
In my early career, I use carrots as an example. It's the crop that I know best. We've more than doubled the yield by the introduction of good F1 hybrids, and I'm not against better genetics at all.
Yeah.
And I'm not against the use of gene marker breeding and all these using technology to accelerate natural things. What I don't like the thought of is, for example, the use of a gene from a spider going into a tomato.
Right.
Now, for me, if you give that a general public test, will never be acceptable.
Right.
But using a gene from a wild potato
Right.
to accelerate something that could be done naturally, I'm absolutely in favour of.
Yeah.
So
I'm
that's
glad
really where
glad you mentioned that example. I think it's a particularly good one because, as you know, there are trials going on at the moment.
That's why I chose that example.
of genetically modified potatoes that carry a gene from a wild potato being transferred into a cultivated variety. And I understand the trials are looking good, so it works. But the point about the potato industry, as you know, is that it's built not on one variety, it's built on a whole raft of different varieties. And I think that one of the advantages of GM, transferring plant genes around between plants, is that it allows you to improve simultaneously 6, 7, 10 different varieties. So we could retain the diversity within the varieties that are used by farmers, but take advantage of the improvement that GM can provide.
It sounds to me like we're broadly agreeing on just about everything, actually.
Well, I think the challenge for us is, I think what we have to remember is, and I'm really glad we're having this conversation because I've been enormously frustrated by the Punch and Judy style of the debate that has happened over the last 15 or 20 years. The issues that we're dealing with here are so serious.
Entrenched arguments don't help anybody.
Indeed.
There's a lot of good ground in between the two extreme camps. And I think, both camps have been guilty of chucking rocks.
I think that's absolutely true.
But, I think there are some massive gains to be made in sustainable farming, particularly in the developing world, just from better management and some from infrastructure investment. The genetics they're using down there are way behind what we're using in Europe anyway. Politicians don't like to talk about population control, but it is starting to come onto the agenda because it's quite clear we can't just keep expanding forever and ever. If we get to 9 or 10 billion, and I don't know where the water's going to come from, let alone the...
Well, these are other issues, and of course it gets to be complicated. So it's not only population control, it's also consumption patterns and consumer behaviour.
Yeah.
So we in developed countries are consuming several times more food. We're eating animals,
particularly red meat. Yeah.
Red meat. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be eating red meat, but maybe a diet with less red meat would be a good thing.
Yeah.
But these are all other issues. What we would not deny is that dealing with production and making production efficient and sustainable is an enormous challenge.
Yeah, well, I think genetics are obviously very useful, but they are just one of many tools that we can use and many areas of advance that we need to make. We need to make big advances in understanding our soils and our soil health and soil biology.
Indeed.
Increasing organic matters, which have gone down, ever decreasingly over the last 50 years. We need to start rebuilding our organic matters.
Indeed.
The use of precision farming to reduce inputs.
I take your point absolutely. I'd just like to mention two examples. So one is in connection with herbicide-tolerant crops. So these facilitate, it's not the only way I know, but these facilitate the use of no-till agriculture. Yep. And this then can be linked to strategies for retaining soil moisture, keeping the organic content in the soil, dealing with soil erosion. So that is a good thing. And so wouldn't it be a good thing if we could start thinking about the use of maybe herbicide-tolerant crops in connection with good farm management?
I take your point, but I think herbicide tolerance has to be treated extremely cautiously. There are definitely examples in North America now where we've got super weeds starting to happen, resistance building up in populations. I'm a vegetable farmer, not a cereal farmer, so min-till isn't really an option for me.
Yeah.
And we've definitely found that as we've used less herbicides and started using more cultivations in both organic and integrated farm management systems, that we've definitely promoted plant growth. We've invigorated plant growth through oxidisation of the soil, releasing nutrients. The trick is to make sure that we can keep replacing and rebuilding that organic matter that obviously every time we cultivate we help release.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that what is happening in North America is an example of bad management of a very useful trait. It doesn't mean, however, that one shouldn't use that trait. One should use that trait perhaps with good management. The other example, I think, is companion cropping. It does seem to me that companion cropping could be an enormously useful approach. Just thinking ahead, could we grow our barley and our beans together in the fields? If we could use the genetics to develop varieties of barley and beans that were adapted to companion cropping, and maybe we'd do that partly by GM and partly by conventional breeding, we could then start growing those together in the fields, reducing the nitrogen inputs because the beans would be fixing nitrogen, and come up with a solution that is better than what we have at the moment.
I forecast for the future that we will find a way through our problems. It will be a number of different things which will come to bear to help us through those problems, including good management, the advances of science. Genetics will be a part of that. Integrated farming will be a huge part of that, but I do think we'll find a way through our problems. We always have in the past, and I've got no reason to believe that we won't in the future. Like
you, I agree that it will involve a diversity of approaches. I would be surprised if it did not involve GM, because I think it's potentially an enormously useful technology. What it can provide is not only an improvement of the various agricultural systems that we have at present, it can also allow us to think forwards into maybe quite a different agriculture than we have at the moment. We could even think about having crops that at present aren't crops at all and turning them into useful plants. So looking over a generation, I think that we will end up with an agriculture that is much better than the one that we've got at the moment. It'll be more diverse, it'll embrace all of these different technologies.